North Korea is one of the world's worst human rights violators, but few efforts have been able to positively affect the humanitarian situation there. Without substantial changes made by the regime itself, there appears very little that the international community can do to improve the plight of the North Korean people. Meanwhile, just as the regime is the main perpetrator of human rights abuses, it is also the main actor that can significantly improve the human rights situation and protect against a broader range of threats, including environmental pollution, infectious diseases, and economic deprivation.
The Los Angeles Times and author of Nothing to Envy, a book about real lives in North Korea. I think the last few months with the crisis over North Korea unfolding, many of us have been distressed that there's been so little focus on the North Korean people. And we're going to be looking at human security in this panel, but looking at not our security, not worrying about people in, is it Austin, Texas, or Colorado Springs who are afraid of being hit by nuclear armed missiles, but the rather more present danger to people inside North Korea who bear the brunt of the sanctions, and I think must be very disappointed that the economic reforms that were promised by Kim Jong-un have not materialized. So anyway, thank you everybody for coming to this one as opposed to the nuclear session in the other room, because it shows some selflessness on your part. We're going to start by defining what human security means. That's Greg Scarlatoiu, who's executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. I have a handy sheet here. He was previously director of the Public Affairs and International Business at Korea Economic Institute, and he is a citizen of honor named so by the city of Seoul.
The condition was that I leave Seoul and never come back.
Okay. So you're in the line of fire. So he's one of you, and you're going to do this in English or Korean or?
We'll do it in English.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Raelyn Campbell is senior officer for the Asia Pacific region for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she is going to speak about health issues. The Gates Foundation is very involved with control of infectious diseases, and she has directed research, policy advocacy, and outreach strategies around global health and other critical issues affecting U.S.-Asia relations for over 15 years at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And she has a very long bio, so I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to take away from the presentations. Dr. Buhm-suk is a research fellow in the International Law and Conflict Resolution Center at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. And he is going to talk about human rights in North Korea. Have we not heard about human rights much lately? That whenever there is a nuclear crisis, human rights seems to fall by the wayside. And we also have Abraham Kim here. I don't have a bio, but you are with the Korea
Economic Institute.
Korea Economic Institute, and I think
Vice President there.
Vice President.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll speak. Yeah. You know what? He can introduce himself.
Sure.
He's a grown up. So.
Vice President of Korea Economic Institute.
Okay.
That's good enough.
All right. We'll start right in. I think, looking at the timing, I think you have 7 minutes each. So, be happy that it's 2 minutes longer than in other sessions. That's how much people think of human security inside North Korea. But go ahead.
Understood. Thank you, Barbara, for the very kind introduction, and I would like to thank the Asan Foundation for today's invitation. I also have to acknowledge one of the board members of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, Dr. Nick Eberstadt of the American Enterprise Institute, who has joined us today. 2 of our former interns, one Asan Academy intern, Young-Sun Jin, and one West intern, Miran Song. They actually helped prep me for today's presentation. Speaking of human security at the simplest level, premature and unnecessary loss of life is perhaps the greatest insecurity in life. In 1994, the UNDP came up with a Human Development Report that proposed the concept of human security for the first time. Certainly, human security and human rights are mutually reinforcing. Human security came as the result of a convergence of factors at the end of the Cold War, while human rights goes back to the days of the Enlightenment and then the system put in place after two great cataclysms ravaged the 20th century. I would like to begin by saying that human security should by no means be employed or be misused to avoid a frank, honest discussion of the human rights situation in North Korea. Once again, the two notions are mutually reinforcing, and human rights provide the connection amongst the 7 elements of human security that the 1994 UNDP report identified: economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political security. Speaking of the economic security of North Koreans, 24 years after the collapse of communism in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, North Korea's centrally planned economy is in an utter state of collapse. What still works is what one of our non-resident fellows, Mr. Kim Kwang-jin, called North Korea's palace economy, North Korea's royal palace economy that produces the hard currency for the Kim family regime. Then there is a people's economy, small-scale trading at the Changmadang, the open-door markets, that developed as a means of survival, as a coping mechanism after North Korea experienced the famine of the 1990s, the Konane Hengun, that may have killed up to 10% of North Korea's population anywhere. Estimates are anywhere between 600,000 and 2 million people. Certainly, North Korea needs to provide the right environment for foreign direct investors if it is to develop. Unfortunately, North Korea continues to be taking all the wrong steps to establish an environment that is not at all conducive to investment. North Korea has defaulted on its foreign debt. North Korea has expropriated Hyundai Asan assets at Mount Kumgang, and most recently, currently, North Korea is in the process of terminating the operation, the joint South North Korean operation at the Kaesong Industrial Zone. Certainly, when speaking about economic security, it's about economic opportunity extended to people. North Korea the North Korean system is based on a social classification system called Songbun. North Koreans are classified into 3 main categories depending on their loyalty to the Kim regime. 25% of North Koreans belong to the so-called core class, about 55% belong to the so-called wavering class, and then the remaining 20% belong to the so-called hostile class. Many of the members of the hostile class end up in political prison camps, oftentimes due to a system of guilt by association called Yonjaje. 3 generations of the same family are imprisoned in the camps. Access to economic opportunity depends on Songbun. There is a current argument that actually money is playing more of a role in North Korea's economy. Well, that may be true, but nevertheless, those who trade, those who are engaged in these small-scale business activities still need to depend on those of good Songbun. We know the story of food security in North Korea. Basically, after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, North Korea lost an important source of aid. In 1994, 90% of the arable land in North Korea was destroyed by flooding. A great famine followed. The situation continues to be dire. 1/3 of North Korean children are malnourished, and basically access to food, not only access to economic opportunity, access to food itself continues to depend on Songbun, on North Korea's social classification system. Certainly health security is affected by the nutritional status of North Koreans. Malnourishment means that immunity levels are also low. North Koreans suffer from various infectious and vector-borne diseases. It is very ironic that, for example, iron deficiency resulting in anemia is prevalent amongst pregnant women in North Korea. One of the greatest natural sources of iron and iodine is miok, seaweed. And as one who used to dive in South Korea, I know that there are vast kelp forests surrounding the Korean peninsula. It is so ironic that North Korean women should suffer from anemia, which leads to the risk of maternal death or various pregnancy complications. We're all aware of the prevalence of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is difficult to treat. Medication is expensive. Drug-resistant forms of tuberculosis are currently developing in North Korea. Environmental security has been severely affected. Irrational deforestation has taken place in North Korea. Because of irrational deforestation, the topsoil dried, the topsoil eroded, and this led in turn to uncontrollable mudslides that affect North Korea every year during the rainy season, with a direct impact on North Korea's food security as well. Certainly, personal security relates to protection from violence, violence in all of its different forms. Violence by state actors, violence by non-state actors, by individuals, by predators, even domestic violence, for example, is included in this concept. Certainly, personal security is very precarious, practically doesn't exist in North Korea, because the government of North Korea systematically employs unlawful violence against its own people. We're all familiar with the terrible stories that we learned from Shin Dong-hyuk, the North Korean young man who was born and grew up in political prison camp number 14. Wall Street journalist Blaine Harden has written a book about his life story. We know that public executions are still happening in North Korea, and we also know that due to the poverty and the extraordinarily dire circumstances, in addition to this violence conducted by the government against its own citizens, North Korea has an astoundingly high crime rate, 15.2 per 100,000 persons. When speaking of community security, certainly community security does not refer to a collective right. No, it's based on the idea that one of the best ways to protect one's personal security is to ensure that the person belongs to a certain community, be it ethnic, religious, or of another kind. And certainly protecting community security refers to protecting the community from the loss of traditional relationship and values. For example, it pertains to protecting the community from sectarian and ethnic violence. In North Korea, there are very serious intra-community tensions. First of all, because of the Songbun system of social classification, with the people of the same country classified into 3 separate categories. Then the government conducts constant surveillance on its own citizens. Neighbors are supposed to spy on their neighbors. Family members are supposed to spy on their relatives. So there is very serious surveillance that's happening, and the end result is that the level of trust in one's neighbors or even family members is very low. Certainly, intra-community insecurity also exists in North Korea in the worst of forms. We have had very credible reports of infanticide and forced abortions in the case of North Korean women who became pregnant with Chinese men along the road of defection. The reason, the horrific reason given by the guards conducting this despicable violence against these women and their children is that food is scarce and they do not want to waste the food on the children of foreign fathers. Political freedom certainly pertains to the freedom of speech, election, religion, assembly, petition, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Although North Korea has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it is bound by the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights as a member of the United Nations. It has ratified the Women's Convention, the Children's Convention. Each and every conceivable human right is being violated in North Korea. Is there a way out of this situation? There might be a way out of the situation. A question I hear all the time, isn't engagement the answer to North Korea's problems? I'm not going to mention the nuclear issues. I know you're not here to listen to us talking about the nuclear issues. The answer is there are vehicles that are already available. North Korea hasn't submitted a report under the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism, under the UPR mechanism, since 2004. There is a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Mr. Marzuki Darusman, former Attorney General of Indonesia. He has never been granted permission to visit North Korea and conduct a site visit. Grant access to the International Committee of the Red Cross. Grant access to other international agencies to assess the human rights situation. There are severe human rights violations. The political prison camps, they need to be taken off the table in complete, verifiable, irreversible fashion. The same goes with the issue of abductees. Full disclosure needs to be provided. If North Korea is to develop, if North Korea is to join the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, for example, the next simple steps would be reducing the defense budget. North Korea's defense budget is way too high for this country to qualify for development assistance. They must collect their national statistical data. They don't have it. They have a very small, insignificant amount of relevant data. Third, allow adequate monitoring of projects, international projects. If they think that humanitarian assistance characters are being too intrusive, they should wait for the development assistance characters because the monitoring standards are much higher. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe let's go closer to the ground and start a little smaller. I think Kurt Campbell told us not to use the terms low-hanging fruit because the healthcare situation is very, very difficult, but I think there's some real, actually positive work being done there. Raelyn Campbell from the Gates Foundation.
Yeah, and I would say I'm going to put a little bit more of a positive spin on things and try and be a little provocative in that sense, but mainly focusing on human security, North Korea, the situation there, some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities that we as donors try and take advantage of. And I'll start off by saying that I'd like to talk a little bit about how we engage later on, because I think the Gates Foundation is known by name, but not necessarily by what we do, unless you're on the front lines or in a government that we work with directly. I'd also like to say that I'm going to qualify my remarks by saying that I'm not a North Korea expert. I have been a student of the region for many years, but one of my favorite lines pertaining to North Korea is that anybody claiming that they're an expert is either an idiot or a liar, and I would like to not be put in either of those categories. And then just kind of trying to keep this from getting too weedy on health, because I don't consider myself necessarily a health expert, and I suspect most people in this room cannot talk about the various vagaries of infectious diseases, and I don't want to bore you with these details. So I just want to throw out some thoughts to be a little bit provocative. And my first kind of premise of what I'm talking about is that relative to other countries, the health situation in North Korea is not that bad. And thus, in some ways, I think human security is irrelevant in North Korea. And I'll try and explain my thinking about that. But I think human security as a concept is a great ideal to aspire to. I think it fits within the context of broadening definitions of foreign policy and defense or in security. I think traditionally defense had been how we define some of those things, but it's really about defense diplomacy and increasingly development as a key aspect of foreign policy and security. And I think, a more integrated and comprehensive approach to health is the ideal that we should all aspire to. But the reality is that various factors, non-state actors, can often intervene and take advantage of where there are governance voids. And I'd like to cite a couple of recent examples that made the news in Pakistan and Nigeria, where vaccinators and health workers were subject to attacks and killed by terrorists and others. So there's definitely a need for security, but oftentimes the reality is that we have to operate in the absence of security and police protection, but there are times that we'll try and reach out to those sides. So just starting off saying I'm somewhat of a skeptic, because I think where human security is the most needed, it's often impossible to be able to put the situation in place that you need. And then the other places where the security exists, it's somewhat irrelevant, because if those pieces are already in place, you just have to kind of work around the system. I think a couple of other challenges are that the police and the security authorities are not necessarily going to see health as a part of their job. So it's getting where you have a government that sees that and can get their various actors to collaborate, that's great. But I really think that it's the cooperations that's most needed. Comprehensive approaches are ideal, but cooperative approaches, in the absence of that, the ability to do that is really what we need. So I'll start off by saying, again, that human security is somewhat irrelevant in the case of North Korea, because the health situation is ironically fairly good when comparing it to other countries that have challenging environments to work within. Obviously there are many problems, human rights problems, political problems, economic problems that we're dealing with, but in the health sphere, North Korea is dysfunctionally functional, is how I would look at it. The health indicators are relatively good. There are some not so good ones, but in terms of access to healthcare, it's relatively good. The security situation compared to a Pakistan or a Nigeria is relatively good. Services, basic services, whether it's police or sanitation, access to clean water, the numbers are relatively good compared to other developing world countries. You have 300,000 healthcare workers. Quality issues might be there, but you do have relatively high vaccination rates. Above 80 or 90% is the threshold for what we call herd immunity. And so you've seen dramatic reductions in infectious diseases, eradication of polio, dramatic reductions in measles, and you're getting 99% vaccination rates, and these are World Health Organization statistics. These are not North Korean government statistics. Again, infectious disease, despite ongoing problems with malaria and tuberculosis. In the case of malaria, you're going from 300,000 cases 10 or 15 years ago to under 10,000 cases. And these are all obviously issues that we should care about. Decreasing cases of child mortality. And I think, there's always room for improvement, but I think that the basic baseline statistics that we look at are relatively good compared to a lot of the countries that we're working in. Still ongoing challenges with funding. Part of North Korea's success is due to a lot of external support for health programs, and I'll speak to that. Domestic funding is only about $30 per person, which does not go very far. But I think the big challenge really for North Korea is finding ways to sustain and improve what has been achieved around infectious disease control, sustaining the vaccination programs, because many of these diseases are preventable with low-cost vaccines. The three largest causes of under 5 child mortality, preterm birth, diarrheal disease, and pneumonia. These are all diseases that can, for the most part, be prevented. And we have seen reductions in those diseases. I think there are other challenges. Maternal mortality, infant mortality rates are still relatively high. But again, compared to other countries, it's not as bad as one would expect, given the other situations in the country. Supply constraints are obviously a problem. Wanted to speak, just to kind of wrapping it up.
Yeah, 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes? I am good, I think. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the foundation. We have about a $3 billion budget for spending globally, and we focus most of that on health because we believe that health is the fundamental building block for development. We focus a lot on impact, innovation, partnerships, and I'd like to be able to go into all of it, but I think really it's the partnership approach, really focusing on multilaterals, to be able to have our impact and taking very innovative approaches to how we engage with multilateral agencies. A lot of people talk in terms of human security, horizontal approaches across systems and vertical approaches to diseases, and I'd like to think that we operate diagonally, and I won't have time to go into that, but basically we like to partner with other donors, governments, to be able to pool our resources to amplify the impact that we can have. We do a lot of smaller kind of bilateral projects, small-scale projects to test out ideas, but for the most part, we're making major investments. And there's two organizations that we work with very closely in North Korea that I'd like to highlight. One is the Global Alliances for Vaccines and Immunizations. That is it's essentially a funding mechanism that allows donors to pool their money and negotiate lower prices with vaccine manufacturers to bring the cost down to allow us to have provide more access to vaccines to those who need them the most. And it had a lot of success in providing hundreds of millions of vaccines to children in the worst off countries. North Korea, about $28 million in support for vaccines, but also strengthening of health systems. And they work through UNICEF and the World Health Organization and partners on the ground that already have established channels, that have assurances in place that resources will not be diverted. And so it and the Global Fund are great organizations to work with to ensure that the products actually reach the people that we want them to, that we want to have access to them. So just closing up a little bit, I think Global Fund similarly allows us to pool resources for, in North Korea's case, malaria and tuberculosis. And I'm going to have to kind of shorten what I was going to say, but I think one of the things we look at is, particularly in environments like this, is finding opportunities for collaboration, public and private sector collaboration. I think it's a great opportunity for U.S. and Korea collaboration. And I think, there's always room for improvement. We've been very encouraged by the current administration's comments about increasing its support for multilateral efforts. And I think this is really critical for the Korean government if it does want to carry through on its intentions to improve the impact of its aid. Korea is essentially doubling its aid in the next few years and going to be reaching a $3 billion budget. And I think if Korea really is intent on helping the humanitarian situation in North Korea, and President Park just released kind of a new tranche of humanitarian relief to support tuberculosis and a couple of other health programs in North Korea.
I'm
done.
I'm sorry.
I'm done.
Okay, sorry.
So just if I think thinking about these types of collaborative approaches, if the South Korean government and others want to be able to really impact the human security, the humanitarian situation in North Korea.
Okay. Dr. Park?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for providing me an opportunity to discuss the issues of human security in North Korea today. As Greg mentioned, the human security means improving human standards of living by actively eliminating the underlying threats to economy, food, health, environment, and even the community, for example. And this extends beyond the passive protection of individuals from war, persecution, disease, famine, and poverty. And my talk today especially focused on the way in which the problematic human rights conditions in North Korea have been and should be dealt with in the dimension of human security. No one has been able to find a clear solution to the human rights problem occurring in North Korea. In fact, without substantial changes made by the North Korea regime itself, there is very little that the international community can do to improve the human rights condition of the North Korean people. We, however, should not assume that the collapse of the North Korea system will bring about the solution to these problems. While it is evident that the North Korea regime is still the main perpetrator of human rights violations, it is also the only actor that can significantly improve the human rights situation. And I believe that in order to change the human rights situation in North Korea, we must start with human rights from below, or the bottom-up approach to the problem. That is, for the improvement of human rights in North Korea, the main force should come from the inside. But the existing civil society and NGOs in North Korea appear to offer no threat to the government because the civil society is very weak and heavily controlled by the government. Therefore, it is necessary for the countries, governments, and the societies from the outside to support the expansion of the civil society groups in North Korea and mobilize them more effectively. Those who most opportunities to directly influence the development of civil society are probably its neighbors, especially countries with relatively close economic and political ties. However, for the last 2 decades, the international community has focused on changing North Korea from the outside. That means that the measures utilized by the international community were primarily formulated according to the political approach. The economic sanctions and humanitarian aid provided in exchange for dismantling North Korean nuclear and missile programs. Furthermore, human rights has been used as a punitive tool designed to hasten the collapse of North Korea. So I believe that the North Korea human rights issue should not be raised only from a confrontational standpoint and should be dealt separately from other political issues, including nuclear one. A comprehensive approach using various methods in different fields, such as dialogue, medical aid, investment, mutual education, and cultural exchange is also necessary. And many skeptics do not believe that this kind of approach has actually contributed to the improvement of North Korean human rights. And I also have to confess that no real assurance exists whether such an engagement and humanitarian aid in any substantial form will be used in constructive purposes and benefit people beyond the favored elites in North Korea. However, from a long-term perspective, a balanced combination of the two types of approach is desirable. The smart sanctions targeted against the decision-making elites, and comprehensive engagement in the fields of culture, education, agriculture, and health. And I believe that only a gradual change from the inside may create the necessary breakthrough to improve the human rights condition in North Korea. And we can call this the human rights-based approach to North Korea human rights issues. So therefore, first, I think it is necessary that the international community makes a frequent contact with North Korea through the diverse channels and close cooperation with the related countries. For example, we can promote consistent initiatives led by the private sector, such as medical aid, and also meetings with the families dispersed in the North and South, and cultural exchanges. Second, while the concern of the international community has been mainly focused on the civil rights aspects, economic, social rights, including the right to food and right to life, should also be addressed. So that's my talk today, and most of my talk is already discussed at international, regional, and national level, but I would like to highlight them again today through this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have some questions for you, but I think I'll wait till
Okay.
after Mr. Kim speaks.
Sure.
So go ahead.
So I have the difficult task of being the fourth speaker in the middle of the afternoon when most of us had arrived yesterday. So many of you are suffering from jet lag. But also I have the role of being a commentator to this literature, human security and North Korea. And when I was asked to speak on this panel, I thought, great, it's going to be a very short panel because essentially I think all of us agree that there is no human security in North Korea. Excuse me. But all joking aside, I think there is a large segment of North Korea's population that is suffering tremendously, and we have to remember that. And I think that's the important point here, that we're talking about people. And two, they are the victims of an autocratic government and often victims of a geopolitical struggle between the North Korean government and the international community. I have four just basic thoughts, and they're primary commentary thoughts as I approach this literature, and I just want to share them with you. I think the first one is, and these thoughts are just for part of our discussion and some troubles that I have in applying the human security literature to North Korea from a conceptual, practical, and also a policy level approach. One, my first point is the concept of human security is too unwieldy. I mean, Greg greatly pointed out that there are multifaceted aspects of human security: food security, economic security, health security, environmental security, personal security, community security, and political security. And what's not quite clear is, well, what is clear is North Korea basically fails on all of these fronts. But what is not clear is that, if it fails on all these fronts, it becomes too analytically, operationally, and strategically unwieldy. So how do you prioritize? What do you focus on first to deal with North Korea's human security problem? And which is the most critical to focus on? My second point, how do you improve human security when the host country seeks only to oppress? There's a difference between a weak state that lacks capacity to provide for its population basic needs and a country that deliberately seeks to abuse its people. So in an oppressive country, you can't promote or develop long-term structural improvements to deal with these human security issues, such as better governance, instilling positive norms, or developing critical processes to protect human security issues. And then we run into another problem, or possibly a dilemma. By promoting human security of citizens in an oppressive society, are we inadvertently perpetuating a political system that needs to be either brought down or to be reformed or forced to be changed? And then there's another dilemma. By seeking to punish oppressive regimes through sanctions because they're building nuclear weapons, and then in the other hand, trying to promote human security of an oppressed society, are we promoting countervailing policies that contradict each other? One example of this that I read is, for example, the sanction efforts in North Korea against its financial structure. For example, North Korea's Foreign Trade Bank is a target of sanctions. From my understanding, from my reading, this is the last foreign exchange bank within North Korea. But oddly enough, this bank also facilitates the international transactions and transfer for the World Food Program and European humanitarian NGOs and even European embassies that are functioning in Pyongyang. Without access to these banks, the European NGOs have to go into Pyongyang with suitcases of cash to deal with these humanitarian efforts. So this is one example of policies having countervailing impact on each other. The third point that came up as I was kind of putting my thoughts together is an important question about South Korea's role in this. Can South Korea really spearhead the solving of North Korea's human security problem? I think the popular notion out there is that South Korea, because of its similar cultural background as with North Korea, low linguistic barriers, and even a common national identity and historic connections, make South Korea the obvious player to help North Korea address its human security issues. But we also need to remember an important dynamics that lay at the core of North-South Korea relations. These are two countries sharing a common national identity, but competing for legitimacy, competing to be the ultimate power over the Korean Peninsula. So allowing South Korea a visible lead in addressing North Korea's shortcomings and restoring it is nothing short of capitulation and undercutting North Korea's long-term legitimacy. So essentially showing that Chuche ideology and this whole military-first ideology has failed. So will North Korea allow South Korea to address its human security issues? And fourth and finally, I think we had, throughout the morning, we had talked about this linkage between domestic politics and international politics. I'd like us to think about how South Korea's domestic policy may impact how we address North Korea human security in the future. It's worth thinking how South Korea is dealing with, for example, its social welfare issues today in South Korea, and what it means for reunification in the future. The notion of, I know as part of the presidential election, there was a lot of talk about economic democratization. There's universal issues related to universal health care, assistance to elderly, universal children, primary education. But we also need to remember that these issues also have an impact for the future. We need to take another page out of the German unification case. What instilled fear and trepidation in West Germany, in the West German government when the wall came down, was not only the fact that tens of thousands of refugees from East Germany were coming to West Germany, but there was also a constitutional mandate that in the eyes of the West German government, there was no East German or West German citizen. Every German was a German. And therefore, they were responsible to provide the social welfare services to these East Germans when they came to West Germany. In other words, they had to deal with the human security needs of the East Germans as well. So that's something worth thinking about for South Korea, as they deal with their own these issues related to social welfare, but that may not immediately have connections to the issues related to reunification. But if you're dealing with citizens now and providing universal care, universal education, and these kinds of things, it may ultimately, if there is a unification in the future, South Korea will be responsible for providing those social welfare issues for North Korea, which will dramatically raise the cost of dealing with human security in the future. So, in conclusion, I just want to reemphasize my first point, which is we can't forget about the people that we're talking about. You know, it's easy for us to be sitting here in the Hyatt Hotel to talk about the problems of human security. But there is a bigger problem that perhaps we are not dealing with wholeheartedly. I mean, in the other room, they're talking about nuclear weapons, they're talking about traditional security issues, and those dominate our headlines. But we can't forget that from focusing on another crisis that lives with us and that may take many generations to deal with, which is the human security problems in North Korea to fix. So we can't ignore these issues. It won't be simple, and they're very complex, and there's no easy solution. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much. Having cut off half of our speakers, we have an extra few minutes, so I will speak myself. My observations are not very academic. They're journalistic and a little bit flabby as a result. I can tell you anecdotes. I've been very interested in the question about what has gotten better, what has gotten worse since Kim Jong-il died in December 2011. In North Korea, it is actually a fast-changing country, and it seems to me that there's quite a bit going on. I'm based in Beijing now, and I go once or twice a year to the North Korean border, and it's just a great place to talk to people who came out of North Korea last week and get a sense of what's going on. I haven't been since October, so maybe some of you who work with defectors have more current information. My sense is that one thing that has gotten better in North Korea is that the crackdown on the markets has stopped, or at least it had as of last year. North Koreans are a little bit freer to buy and sell, provide for themselves, get out of their non-paying day jobs and collect firewood and herbs or make cake or tofu. And that has helped somewhat in terms of people's income. My sense is also that the overall food situation is not any better than it ever was. I think we saw a famine in the 1990s that leveled off, but my sense is that people are still chronically underfed. They never have enough to eat, and what they do have to eat is very low quality. North Koreans have told me maybe 1 out of 1,000 can afford to eat white rice regularly. I mean, as you know, because half of you are Korean, rice is food. People are eating a diet very heavy on corn, often corn cobs, corn husks that are ground up to make a corn meal. It's not nutritious. It's actually kind of dangerous if your digestive system is bad. I've heard some very credible accounts recently about severe malnutrition in the military, and for all our talk about what the North Koreans spend on the military, the rank and file soldiers are hungry. I talked to a woman from Pyongyang, this was in October, who said her son had been discharged because he was so sick from the diet. He was a big guy, and they got just potatoes as their rations, and he couldn't live on it, and he was on the verge of death, and they discharged him, and she was trying to nurse him back to health. We hear a lot of these stories about the potatoes. Others will have a better sense than I do about the electricity, but I've been hearing very alarming reports about what seems like the reallocation of the electricity to Pyongyang. Overall, I think since Kim Jong-il died, Kim Jong-un has shored up his support among the elites by diverting resources to Pyongyang, and they did the big bash last year for the centennial of Kim Il-sung's birth. They had a lot of lights, a lot of events. There's a lot of new construction that's come online, but I think that's at a cost. And I think Jean Lee from Associated Press touched on this on her recent story about the Bright Lights Big City. I don't know, others may disagree. I'm really glad that AP has a bureau in Pyongyang. That's something else to discuss. But you have a lot of new glitzy stuff in Pyongyang. You have the Times Square style bulletin board above the train station using a lot of light. You have these very nice new apartment buildings that are illuminated at night. But from what I'm hearing, and again, people with access to satellites should know better, that Hamhung Chongjin electricity worse than ever. I talked to some people who came out of Hamhung about 2 weeks ago, and they said it was completely black at night, nothing. They were only there for 2 days. But, again, worse than ever. And I think this is part of a strategy to, shore up the core class that Greg was talking about at the expense of everybody else. North Korea is, the ultimate example of the country wrestling with guns v. butter. I think guns v. butter was Hermann Göring, and the way Kim Jong-il put it was, we need bullets, not sugar. But they're allocating a lot of resources to these weapons programs. They're allocating a lot of resources to the vanity construction projects in Pyongyang, and I think regular people are suffering. And again, my sense is, with each year, more and more people have some experience of China. They maybe, I think most of them come out to China to work, and then they go back in. There's not as much overall defection because it's so hard to get out. But people know, and they're yearning for what North Koreans have described to me as a normal life. We just want to have a normal country. And I'm not even talking about human rights. I'm just talking about the very basic rights to, eat 2 meals a day. Let's not even talk about 3. I'm curious, for those of you doing rights, do you have any sense of things getting any better? Do you want to go? Yep.
Yes, more than happy to answer that question. Things are not getting any better. Mm-hmm. To give you an example, we are currently collaborating with Digital Globe, a global provider of satellite imagery, to monitor the North Korean political prison camps. Camp number 25 in Cheongjin, North Hamgyong province, has increased 2-fold recently. Amnesty International worked with the same company, with Digital Globe, to take a look at Camp 14. Camp 14, where Shin Dong-hyuk used to be held, has also expanded, and it's spilled into the adjacent village. We can think of 3 main reasons why the camps have expanded. Number 1, the very aggressive purge that's been conducted since early 2009, as North Korea began proceeding with preparations towards the second hereditary transmission of power. Reason number 2, an intensified crackdown on attempted defections. In 2011, more than 2,800 North Koreans settled in South Korea, North Korean defectors. In 2012, there was a 46% drop, only over 1,500 North Koreans resettled in South Korea. The reason for that is not that things improved overnight in North Korea. There is an intensified border crackdown on the Chinese side of the border, more surveillance cameras. On the North Korean side of the border, more patrols. Patrols rotate more frequently to make sure that the brokers do not develop a relationship with the patrols or the border guards. The third possible reason is a downsizing of the camps that are close to the border with China. Camp number 22 in Haeryong, North Hamgyong province, is one of these facilities. The camp is close to the border. There is some Chinese business activity in the area. There are some Chinese tourists traveling around the area. Also, if prisoners manage to find their way to escape from the camp, it's easier to escape across the border and escape into China. Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, all indications seem to tell us that the situation of human rights under the Kim Jong-un regime hasn't been getting any better.
Yeah. So, something that I've never been able to get a grasp on are Or is it that there are fewer North Korean defectors in China, or there are fewer coming to South Korea? It seemed to me in the past that the South Korean government kept a very tight rein on how many came in, and that there was a controlled number.
Under the previous and the current administration of South Korea, I don't think that has been too much of an issue. I think that the South Korean government has made good efforts to welcome and accommodate North Korean defectors here in South Korea.
I've seen something very different among the defectors in the last few years. Most of the people I've met in China have been relatively well-connected, and a lot of older women, many party members who seem to have paid their way out. Sometimes they've gotten, family visit visas, and much fewer of the homeless children and the really poor. Is that reflected in the defectors coming to South Korea?
What I noticed from the reasons to reduce of the defectors to South Korea is also the one reason what you mentioned, intensifying the border control, but the other reasons that when I did the interview with the defectors, they go out with China and North Korea, and they can get the money and economic benefits through the businesses with China. So slightly there are not many the number of the people who don't need to come to South Korea because of the economic reasons. That's what I heard. Also, what you mentioned, is it any better situations in North Korea, especially related to the basic rights? As you mentioned, the malnutrition rates reduced, and the economic development gap between the regions in the North Korea. The gap of the economic development in the different regions in North Korea has reduced. So I think that's also the
So
factors
you think there's been some improvement in terms of food?
Yeah.
I'm curious, I'll ask one more and then I'll open up. As people who focus on human security inside North Korea, do you worry about the effect of the sanctions regime on North Korean people? I mean, you just mentioned that the NGOs are having difficulty with the sanctions on the banks. I mean, anybody?
The sanctions regime is designed to prevent proliferation by North Korea, and it is also designed to put pressure on North Korea's elites. The sanctions regime is not to be blamed for the very dire situation that the people of North Korea find themselves in.
I went to North Korea in 2011. I think that's when we first met Barbara, in Beijing. And one of the issues that I went in with a group of academics, and one of the things that we were looking for is the efficacy of sanctions. And we were looking at, I think you had recommended that we look at the women's shoes, their haircut, and how new the cars were, and different things like that. And we had interviewed investors, 2 foreign investors that were coming in. And basically, one of the questions we ask is, how has sanctions impacted your business and your investments? And basically, they told us that they chuckled a little bit, and they said, well, basically, we can get anything we want in Pyongyang. It just costs more. It takes a little longer. And so, and in terms of cars, relatively new, and in terms of hairstyle, the hairstyles you would see in Korean South Korean soap operas, and their shoes were, I'm not a professional in women's shoes, but I am married, so I know what decent shoes look like. So, I guess so. But it seemed apparent that these things were coming in, and people, the elites at least, were getting what they wanted, and so I think the efficacy is probably of question. So.
Okay. I think we can take questions now. Yes, Nick Eberstadt. I think you can speak up.
I usually have no problem speaking up.
Yeah.
Nick Eberstadt from American Enterprise Institute. I know my friend Raelyn Campbell was trying to be provocative a bit in talking about the health situation in the DPRK, but I wanted to offer just a cautionary comment because the question of what we know and how we know it really matters there. The DPRK has conducted only 2 national population counts in its history, the so-called 93 one, which was conducted in 94, and the 2008. Those are full of inconsistencies and internal contradictions. And the easiest way to explain those contradictions is to suggest that the regime was trying to hide the military in 93 and trying to hide the famine in the 2008 one. For what it is worth, if you take the figures at face value, the sorts of survival rates it suggests for older people, for people who were 40 or older in 93, is more or less like the survival schedules for Somalia, which is not like a super great health environment. The DPRK also has done its own nutritional surveys, which I think are terribly problematic. One of their early nutritional surveys suggested that the percentage of children subject to low birth weight, the prevalence of biologically high-risk low birth weight children there, was a little bit lower than the contemporary prevalence of Asian Pacific children in the United States of America, in which case North Korea should have been giving the United States food aid, right? They've done away with those low birth weight numbers, they've kind of suppressed that stuff. My point is that there are real reasons to be afraid that the North Korean government is politically manipulating or doctoring the data that we get on social and human indicators. And in fact, I think that should be our first assumption until proved otherwise. And the corollary to that is that outside partners who are working with the DPRK should be absolutely ruthless. They should be absolutely savage about insisting on new, independently collected data of their own.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Olivia Enos from the Heritage Foundation. As somebody who lives in the United States but is very interested in getting involved in ways to help the human rights issues going on in North Korea, what is the most productive way that somebody on the outside of North Korea can really engage and try and obviously promote awareness about human rights issues in North Korea, but also create some more practical change? I know that there are some really valuable organizations already in place, but I imagine that there are also special niche areas that maybe aren't getting covered as much, or are certain aspects of the human rights crisis that we're just not dealing with for either practical purposes or because nobody is kind of willing to step up and do that. So I'd be interested in getting pretty much anybody's opinion on that. So thank you.
Right, Greg?
I guess that researching and publishing on the actual situation of North Korean human rights is very important. Public information campaigns are very important. Through Barbara's book, through Blaine Harn's book, through the good and hard work of human rights organizations all over the world, we've made extraordinary progress in terms of awareness building. On the 21st of March, we know that a resolution establishing a commission of inquiry on North Korean human rights was established. This commission will bring significant resources to the table. In addition to the special rapporteur, 2 more investigators, 10 to 20 staff members. This position used to be a part-time position. This is not a time to lose our focus and concentration and start talking about different types of programs, including exchange programs. I think we need to step up international pressure and persuade the North Korean government that the one channel of communication with the outside world is this channel of communication addressing the human rights situation. Secondly, information will be key to bringing change to North Korea. We need to inform the North Korean people on their own human rights situation, on the egregious human rights violations happening in the country. We need to inform them on the truth about the outside world of liberal democracies, and we need to inform them on the corruption of their own elites, including the Kim family.
In addition to the COI issues, through their report of the COI Commission of Inquiry, they can suggest whether there is any crimes of humanity, and they can ask to the General Assembly to bring their case to the Security Council to the ICC. So it can be in future for the alarming to the high-ranking officers in the regime in North Korea.
My name is Ko Myung-hyun from the Asan Institute. I just wanted to make a quick comment in defense of Raelyn and also a comment on Nick's comment again. I think we are actually think about the trade-off between bias and trend. Definitely there's bias in North Korean statistics. We have such strong suspicions that North Korean government is actually overstating certain numbers to make the situation look good. But on the other hand, we also have to focus on the trend. I mean, if you look at the nutrition surveys go way back to the early 90s and continues on to to last year. And if you look at the trend is improving. So, I mean, you can take that at the face value, with the face value, or you can take that in different ways. But then, so what does it mean? I mean, I think if the trend is improving, and even if the North Korean government is making up the numbers, but I think in a way, like the North Korea is better than before, better than the situation in the 90s when they're going through the mass starvation. But that doesn't mean that North Korea is in a good state. It's just better off. So I think that's why we see these kind of contradictions. And if you look at the different statistics in anecdotes, we see that in some anecdotes we see like North Korean people suffering a great deal. But on the other hand, if you look at certain statistics, we see that the situation improving. The problem is that we are in a way in a transition period. We are in a improving stage, but it doesn't mean that that's the end of the world.
And just piggybacking on that, I think I actually avoided malnutrition and food security issues because I think those are very hard numbers to capture even in an ideal situation. Measuring how many people are malnourished is a challenge. Whereas vaccines or drug treatments or bed nets, these are things that you can count and you can, to a certain extent, track. But the other part of it is they're not necessarily items that would be marketable. People are not going to buy a vaccine. It's not going to be effective if it hasn't been maintained in cold chain storage. These are products that are very hard to divert for a government or other entities. And so if they're products with little black market value or regular market value, then they're not assured to get to their intended targets, but there's a much higher chance. And we're more reliant, and to a certain extent our partners are somewhat reliant on the government. But when you're looking at UNICEF or the World Health Organization or other UN bodies, they actually have people on the ground and can tell if measles outbreaks are happening and basically know that the statistics are not correct. Whereas malnutrition, as I said, is something that's really hard to track.
Hi, Vicky Cheap from the Tokyo Foundation. I was just interested, Barbara, in your impression of what, from being in Beijing, what China's reaction is to this increasing attention to the human security or human rights aspect of what's happening in North Korea. I'm not sure if Blaine's book has been translated over there or into Chinese, or your book as well. But as we were hearing this morning, that the relationship between China and North Korea is developing, and that the previously idea of a cozy relationship isn't necessarily the case anymore. What's the public reaction in China to what's happening in North Korea on the human rights aspect, not just the nuclear one, which we always hear about?
I think on the Chinese government side, I don't think the Chinese government is very focused on human rights in North Korea. They don't see it as the problem. They certainly are focused on the nuclear proliferation and North Korean provocations that they see leading to an increased U.S. presence in the region. Chinese people, I think the public sentiment is quite against North Korea. I think many, sort of ordinary Chinese are a bit embarrassed by North Korea. They see it as a country stuck in the worst periods of Chinese history. I mean, I always describe North Korea as, stuck somewhere between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And, it's an embarrassment to Chinese who have grown up and gone beyond it. And I think, to somebody who's covered North Korea and lives in China, I'm quite impressed by how far China has come looking at it through the prism of North Korea. My book has not been translated into Chinese in the mainland. It's it's done very well in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and there have been several mainland publishers that have expressed an interest, and they're always told at the end, "too sensitive." I'm assuming that Blaine's book has not been translated on the mainland. I haven't talked to Blaine about it, but I could, bet you it hasn't. Anybody else? I think this is probably the last question.
Thank you for your oral talks. And actually, I'm a student from Asan Academy, and and in your talks, I really appreciated about Dr. Kim's opinion, because I could know about South Koreans' position about this human security issue of North Korea. So I'd like to ask some question about it. Actually, you mentioned that the difficulty about South Korean domestic policy process about to deal with this issue, and you also mentioned the law of South Korean government about this issue. So my question is that what could be the first step of actors in South Korea to deal with this kind of issues in terms of your perspective?
So if I understand your question, what can the South Koreans do to prepare to deal with North Korean human security issues? Well, that comment that I made was based on from the North Koreans' perspective. I mean, the fact that I think in Washington D.C. and other places, it's people say, well, the South Koreans can take a lead in dealing with these issues. But what I meant by that is we often forget there's a bigger issue of the competitive legitimacy, I guess, or a competition of legitimacy, and there's a bigger kind of inter-Korean competition that's going on there. And so, of course, many South Koreans believe and want to take the lead, but from the North Koreans' perspective, would they want the South Koreans to take a lead and expose their people to South Korea, which is not the case. And so it makes it difficult from the North Koreans' perspective. Why would they accept the South Koreans to take the lead in doing that? Of course, they'll take the humanitarian efforts and things like that, but they'll isolate, they'll prevent. I mean, it's not by accident that Kaesong is an isolated special economic zone. It's not an accident that Kumgangsan is was an isolated zone. And so, and my fourth point, my last point when I had mentioned about South Korea, what I wanted to do is be, I guess, a little bit provocative and to understand that political decisions today in South Korea dealing with, taking care of welfare issues in South Korea may seem like a domestic issue, right? I know a lot of those issues were discussed during the presidential election, but but those may have long-term implications and may actually increase the cost of reunification in the future, is my point. Because if we use the example from the German case, for example, they had all of these. I don't think anyone imagined that the social welfare system in Germany, the general social welfare system, would have played an important factor in driving German unification, because all of a sudden the West German government was responsible for all these thousands of East Germans coming over, and now they didn't imagine now they would have to support these East Germans. And so therefore, the calculation in the West German is, you stay on East Germany, go back to East Germany, and we will bring the wealth of West Germany to East Germany so that they didn't have a humanitarian disaster in West Germany. And that was part of what played into helping drive the German unification. I mean, of course, there were a lot of other factors, but But my point is that there are things that are occurring in South Korea's domestic politics and issues related to social welfare and things like that that will have implications for human security issues in North Korea. So that's kind of what I was saying. And honestly, I don't know. I don't know what the South Koreans. I mean, one of the things, of course, President Lee's government from the previous administration said a unification tax, but of course, you know how far that went. so anyways, with that.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. It's coffee break time, so thank you very much.